Welcome to Everyday Martial Artist, a weekly podcast where you'll join me, Brian Doucette, as I interview a different martial artist each episode and hear their story. Some guests you may have heard of, and some you probably haven't. Be sure to subscribe where all your favorite podcasts are available. Also visit our website at everydaymartialartist.com. If you're listening for a specific interview, I sure hope you'll stay and check out the other episodes. A very special thank you to Topher Williams for our custom theme music. And now, the newest episode of Everyday Martial Artist. Everyday Martial Artist is brought to you by KOOnline.com for all your martial arts needs. Sparring and safety gear, rank belts, uniforms, weapons, patches, and more. Wholesale supplies made by martial artists for martial artists. Visit us today at ko-online.com. Hello and welcome to Everyday Martial Artist. I'm your host, Brian Doucette, and as we do every week, we're joined by a brand new guest talking about their life and their journey throughout the world of martial arts and other stuff they're involved in. My guest today has over 45 years experience in martial arts and is one of the world's leading authorities on the art of Wing Chun. He's also studied grappling, kickboxing, Kali and escrima, Jeet Kune Do, karate, and both Asian and European weaponry. Since 1985, he's taught Wing Chun to the general public, security, law enforcement, including police, FBI, Delta, and Navy SEALs, and also professional athletes, including members of the San Francisco 49ers, Seattle Seahawks, and Arizona Cardinals. He's also trained many well-known actors such as Robert Downey Jr., Orlando Bloom, Jake Gyllenhaal, Tobey Maguire, Gerard Butler, John Saxon, and Christian Bale. He himself is also an actor and fight choreographer with 30 years of experience in stage, TV, and film, including projects like Sherlock Holmes 1 and 2, Iron Man 3, and The Avengers. He's written for and been featured in numerous martial arts magazines and fitness and media publications. He's also a screenwriter, musician, husband, and father. Please welcome my guest today, Mr. Eric Oram. How you doing today, sir?
I'm well, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing great, and I truly appreciate your time. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about you.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, what we like to do with all my guests, I want to go back to the very beginning. I mentioned you have over 45 years of experience, but I want to know where that started. I want to know where that first interest, that first spark came from that kicked off your martial arts journey.
Right. Well, I guess backing up even one more step. When I was born, I had a slight deformity in my legs. So I was quite bow-legged and my feet were sort of turned inward, and I had to wear corrective braces for a little bit. Wow. And so I wasn't projected to be any kind of a real athlete, especially from the waist down. So cut to 10 years later, 10-year-old, I was getting picked on pretty good at school. And out of frustration, I finally went to my dad and asked him for some advice. And without really saying much, he screened for me. He was a huge film buff, and we had a pretty sizable film collection. And he screened for me Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon.
Nice.
And it flipped my lid. And when it was over, he turned to me and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I want to do that."
Nice. That
little guy can do it. Maybe this half a chance. So my dad had some experience in martial arts and some pretty good street sense. And long story short, had studied some judo in the Air Force and so on. And it was a pretty good street fighter, street sense and so on. And he did some research I grew up in Las Vegas, out in the edge of the desert back in the day. We were sort of the edge of civilization and horses and whatnot. And my dad did a bunch of research of locally what was available, and he decided that a certain karate studio was as good as it was going to get in Las Vegas at that time. And it happened to be a chapter of one of Ed Parker's students. Had a black belt in one school, and Christopher Keys was the instructor at the other. I did that for a bit, 4 years, give or take, and it definitely introduced me into a lifestyle of focus, discipline, respect, and all that goes with that. And at the same time, and the bully situation worked itself out, I learned enough and some confidence enough to stand up and confront that. And then it went beyond that. I had an incident around the same time, when I was, give or take, when I was 10, give or take. Mm-hmm. So late 70s. And I was at a friend's baseball game at the concession stand in between stuff, and I was getting a Coke or something, and these guys were in line with me right behind me, and they started harassing me to give them $1, give them the $1 that I had in my hand.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't do it. I just wanted no trouble. I just want my Coke, and I want to get out of here. And they kept popping me in the back of the head until I gave it to them, and I wouldn't do it. So I was half their size, but I guess I inherited a little bit of my father's stubbornness. So I wasn't going to give him the dollar. And finally, he popped me one more time, and I spun around, and I was really shy, introverted, happy-go-lucky kid. I didn't want any trouble. But I told him, I said, don't do that again. And there's a bunch of them, and they're all, oh, what are you going to do? So they popped me again, and that's the last thing I remember.
Oh, wow.
And the next thing I remember is getting pulled off of one of those kids with his face down in a pool of blood, and I was ramming his head into the concrete.
Jeez.
And there was a couple of the other guys that were on the ground, and I kind of came out like I woke up out of a dream, and oh, my God, what is going on? And so it was a whole thing, and later on, my friend and some other witnesses kind of pieced together for me what actually went down, and one of them ended up pulling a knife on me, and that's when I really freaked out, and that was the guy that was on the ground. But what it really did was that was my first exposure to the mental aspect, the mental and emotional aspect of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't handle it well.
Yeah.
I would flip my lid. I went somewhere else. I blacked out, and I woke up, and I happened to get sort of lucky that I was able to prevent these guys from hurting me. And they could have, but that raised that question in my brain, like, what was that? And I don't ever want to ever have that happen again. And when, for martial arts, that first whole journey within the Kempo Karate was deconstructing certain things and breaking it down, and it helped take that emotional charge out of physical conflict.
Okay.
So that was all really very valuable, but as a system, it wasn't clicking with me. And I learned a lot of like hypothetical and sort of choreographed techniques, but when we would spar, these things would go out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And I was having a really hard time putting things together and sparring. And meanwhile, I'm winning trophies in the katas. So I'm trying to figure out where the discrepancy is. And by this time I was like 13 going on 14. And meanwhile, my dad decided he wanted to get back into martial arts. And my dad, being my dad, he bought up every single book he could find at the time in the stores, whatever, through the mail, whatever he could do, and hundreds of books, whatever videos. We had Betamax at the time, and he's buying Betamax and some VHS tapes and whatever instructional stuff. And after all his research, he decided that William Chung's Wing Chun was the most practical, effective, and scientific system he could find. And that's what he wanted to learn.
Wow.
By the way, he was Bruce Lee's primary instructor and was Bruce's inspiration in the martial art. So, okay, wow, sign me up. How does this happen? He said, well, there's a problem. He's in Melbourne, Australia. Okay. So my dad, being my dad, he contacted Sifu, and a few months later, Grandmaster William Chung is sitting in our living room in Las Vegas in 1983.
Wow.
And was talking about the logistics of what it would take to get us going into training. So my dad owned and ran an advertising agency, and he used some of his resources to help set up Sifu's early seminar tours because he wanted to have more of a presence in the U.S. at that time. And so I think he'd only have conducted maybe one workshop at that point, maybe two ever. And there was a huge need for it as well. So my dad helped set up his seminar tours in the beginning and managed those, set him up with a manager, and got that all underway. And in turn, we were able to set up a situation where we could start learning from him. So we'd bring seminars to Vegas, and of course I would attend. And then if we do Los Angeles, and then I'd go to LA and I'd attend those. And then soon I started traveling to more and more and more. And it sort of picked up from there.
Wow.
And that's how I got underway. And in that first lesson, though, when Sifu first came to the house, he took us out back, and we had a room out back behind the house. We called it the gym that my dad built for us to train. And he had me do one of my forms from Kempo, which I did. And he kind of, okay, and now I want to have you do some sparring. So one of my dad's friends, who was also a fairly experienced martial artist, he served as my kind of sparring partner, and we started going random for, I don't know, whatever it was, 10, 15 seconds. And he says, okay, stop. You're hurting my eyes. So he says, here's your problem. You don't understand the principles of fighting. And I said, what do you mean principles? And he said, the rules of fighting you don't understand them. He said, you got movement, you have techniques, but you don't understand the rules of fighting. And I was a little still kind of confused and also extremely nervous. And he explained, he said, when your parents raise you, I assume they give you a set of principles, life principles to live by. Don't cheat, don't steal, golden rule, do the right thing. And then you take those principles out into everyday life and you apply them according to the situation as it comes up. They can't possibly anticipate every single hypothetical situation you're ever going to encounter in your entire life and give you a hypothetical answer to deal with that hypothetical situation. It's too much. You can't process that. But you have the principle, it's clear, and then you relate that principle to the situation and you respond accordingly. He said, fighting works the same way. You need to understand the principles. And then he explained, and he kind of started going into it as for some examples. And I learned more in that first 30 minutes in terms of fighting strategy and really how to get inside of the whole experience and how to take control of it, where to look, where to move, how to put everything together, and the guiding principles and strategies that the techniques then are the servants of those principles and strategies. So that kind of bent my mind toward a whole different way of thinking, and that made sense to me. In my brain, the way I work, I need to see the big picture. And if I can't see the big picture, you're showing me little details, but my brain's not, I'm still kind of spinning because I don't get where that detail fits within that bigger picture.
Right.
So it really helps for me to understand the macro to understand how to process the micro, those little details, the adjustments, the specifics. So right out of the gate, I knew I was dealing with something completely different. And when I was also around that, when I first started martial arts around 10 or 11, I got to interview Muhammad Ali for his fight in preparation for Larry Holmes. It was part of it was called Student Update, the sixth grade school that I was going to at the time. They had this little roaming journalist thing for a few of the kids, and we go out into the community and video performers on the Las Vegas Strip or somebody in a play or a politician or whatever it was, and we got the call to be able to go interview Muhammad. Wow. And I was, of course, my dad I was well aware of, I've seen most of his fights going back from, Cassius Clay and so on, and was thrilled. And I got to spend a little he basically at the end of the whole thing, he kind of pulled me in the ring with him a little bit before we left.
Wow.
And that rocked my world, changed my life, and having that presence, that energy in front of me and just being in awe of that as he's moving around and he's trash talking me and I'm, in your pants, you're going to pee, I'll knock you out in 3.
That's awesome.
Terrifying and awesome all at the same time.
Yeah.
But the reason I mention it is because when I met Sifu, when we first went in the room with him, he had that energy. He had that presence. He was like a panther who was just kind of able and willing to pounce at any time. Just calm, smooth, but it's like you knew he was just looking through you at all times. It was such an incredible and impactful energy. And then, in turn, made a tremendous amount of sense. So right from the very beginning, it made sense to me intellectually, and then it started making more and more sense to my body. It's an ambidextrous system. So doing everything equally on the left and the right sides was a huge challenge. I am a drummer, and I started drums the same year that I started martial arts when I was 10. So fortunately, some of that multi-limb coordination, brain-body, motor pathway connections definitely played a good part in helping me keep up when we were trying to launch and first learn the system.
Wow. What a story. I'm blown away by that. I mean, just to meet two people that huge in that short amount of time in your life and just learn that much. So as far, you started out learning through seminars and stuff with him. How long did the seminars go on before you were able to start learning actual consistent lessons?
Pretty much right away. Part of the arrangement was that we would do private lessons in addition to the seminars.
Okay.
We'd get the public time as well as the one-on-one. And then right in the very beginning of it, both my dad and Sifu coordinated it to where Sifu's best student in America, especially at that time, was a gentleman named Blaine Collins, who was living up in Redwood City in Northern California, and electrical engineer. And they helped move him to Vegas so we could start the training full time. And so when Sifu was in town, we'd train as much as we could with him and or follow him around. And then day to day, we would train with Blaine, who was very, 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 very skilled, accomplished martial artist. He had done multiple systems. He had wicked hands, wicked feet, certainly possessed a hairbreadth of a mean streak, and 10 years my biological senior. And basically all of them, all my Sihings and my Sifu, their attitude at the time was they didn't really care what my age was. If I was serious about training, then I had to just keep up. And if he didn't like it, get out.
Wow.
So I had this kind of balance of my Sihing and my Sifu keeping me in check.
Okay. And how long did that go? Like, how long were you in Vegas?
I lived there until I was 24, I believe I was, when I moved to Los Angeles.
Okay.
So I trained consistently from 14 to 24.
Okay.
And I trained with Sifu since 1983. The last time I touched hands with him was 2016.
Okay. What led you to California?
I originally moved to go to grad school, studying acting and directing and film combat.
Oh, cool. Any time in that 10-year span, did you start doing any teaching yourself, or did that come later?
Well, as it turned out, Sifu felt that teaching was part of the training.
Okay.
When I was 16, I had this music opportunity come up to join an established sort of high-profile rock band of the day.
Okay.
And I would have had to, at that point, run away from home in order to be able to go join this rock band.
Mm-hmm.
Dad wasn't so keen on that. So, and especially looking back, I get it. I understand, especially once I had kids, it's a whole different. But at the time, that's all I wanted. And I opted to not run away from home and join a rock band. So, but there was a lot of teenage angst and anger and so on. And I decided, long story short, to channel that into the training. And shortly after that, Sifu noticed that sort of turbo boost of, we'll call it enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm.
And started taking me a little more seriously and invited me to apprentice him in New York for a seminar back in 85. And he was still pretty new to the States. And the workshops in those days, you know, people come from all over the country, all over the world, just to get a piece of him and experience his energy and his knowledge, his skill. And he was so fast, so powerful, so smooth, so effortless, and just ferocious. He was fearless, didn't care who was in front of him. It was just very palpable energy. So it was a very successful seminar. It was just a huge attendance. And I had flown out on a week in advance to help train some other folks for their testing. So I had that responsibility. And the expectation was when he shows up, they better be just so. So we do the gradings and then I stay on for the next week as his apprentice for the workshop.
Okay.
So we got through the first week, had my first challenge match, training adults most of these guys have been doing martial arts longer than I've been alive. And so that was sort of the first adjustment as a teacher. And then the first day of the workshop was just a smashing success. He knocked it out of the ballpark. The energy was electric. And it was 8 hours of training a day for 5 days. It was Monday through Friday. And so day 2, everybody comes back and the energy in the room was just like, wow. Day 1 was like, are you kidding me? What's day 2 going to be like? And Sifu said that in the morning we bowed in and he said, you know, I have a certain lesson plan that I want to get through, but I don't necessarily care what order. So if somebody has a request that you want to see sooner than later, if it's on my lesson plan, I'm happy to platform it. So somebody immediately raised their hand and they said, you know, are we going to cover chum kill form? It's the second of our 3 empty hand forms. Okay. And he said, yes, I plan to cover some chum kill and some of its applications. You want to do chum kill? And everybody said, yeah. And he said, chum kill form. You want to do chum kill? He said, yeah. And he points to me and he says, Eric will show you. And he walked out of the room. And every head turns to me like, really? You, kid, you're going to show us what's going on? So that was that moment where he had thrown me to the fire. And after a moment of panic, what came into my head was, I don't know how to teach, but I know the form. So all I could think to do was turn around and just start doing the form over and over and over again and repeating it until everybody in the room was doing it with me. Okay. And That was how he threw me into it. And every once in a while, it felt like an eternity, but it may have been like a half an hour or so later, I just saw his head little kind of peek around the corner. All right. And off he goes, and finally came out after a while and put me out of his misery and started getting into it and giving the details and the applications. And this is why we do this and how we do that and how what. But that's how it started. So I feel like
funny.
I launched in the summer of 1985 as an instructor, and I was teaching professionally as of the next year, starting in 1986.
I actually have a similar story that happened to me, because when I was in my traditional Taekwondo instructor, I had started assisting with class a little bit, and he came up to me after class one day. He goes, "Would you ever want your own class?" I'm like, "Yeah, someday, sir. I think it'd be fun." He goes, "All right, be here Tuesday night at 7:30. I'm like, "Oh, yes, sir." And I thought he was just going to like bring me there to train. And I walk in and there's all these other students out there. And I thought it was going to be like just us. I'm like, "Oh, maybe it's like an instructor class." And they're all higher ranks than me. I think I was a purple belt at the time in traditional Taekwondo. And he goes,
How old were you?
I was 21. I was 21.
Yep.
Yeah. And he goes, "Class." And they all stop. "Yes, sir." And he goes, "Mr. Bryan's in charge." And he left. He's like, he looks at me, he goes, "This is your class. If they don't listen, give them push-ups." And he walked out. And
Awesome.
I'm assuming he must have talked to them beforehand and told him he's going to do that, because no one looked like shocked like you got. But it was, baptism by fire. I was like, I got through it, and I taught that class for I think 2 years, and I taught people higher ranked than me for quite a while, and I learned a lot. And one thing I've always said is you learn your own stuff so much better when you teach it to other people. That's the thing I got out of it the most. I love that part of teaching. So yeah, that's kind of funny that I thought it was just me.
No, sir.
That's good. So think back to that. Think back to that first seminar to now. You still teach to this day. Over all those years, what do you think has changed about your teaching style over the years?
Okay. So I was sandwiched between a gentleman that designs I don't even know what he does. Most of what to this day, what Blaine does is classified. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
High level technology. So he's an engineer. So with Blaine, I was held accountable for having to analyze every square inch of every piece of every part of the movement, the principles, the strategies, and the concepts of the system. So inside and out, backwards and forwards, I had to be able to articulate the leverage, the physics behind the movement. Certain muscle groups are firing while others are relaxing. So breaking down the precision of the engineering of all of it. Versus Sifu would tell you once, maybe twice, and then he'd just start hitting you.
Okay.
Kick, hit and pull and knocking you on the ground. So he would just start doing it. So it was tactile and visceral. And Blaine was also that, but also highly technical. So I was sandwiched with both. So as a teacher, in the beginning, because I had that technical information and I learned that I could articulate it. So I sort of thought in the beginning, part of my job was to articulate this understanding to you as the student. And I got pretty good at that. And I had some pretty skilled practitioners as a result of it. But I realized as I got a little bit older more and more that it was less and less important, long story short, of what they understood, especially for most students they're not going to, immerse themselves and have this be completely a way of life for them. The normal average student is maybe coming in a couple of times a week, maybe 3 times a week. And those 3 hours or what they invest, maybe a little bit, the exception is maybe some students will give a little bit of extra time in between those and do some homework versus we train 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours a day and 4, 5, 6, sometimes peak times 7 days a week. So it's not time passed, it's time spent. Mm-hmm. So I had to adapt and adjust my thinking to where look at each individual student and look at their life situation and try to adapt and adjust what's relevant to them, what is going to best draw from this giant toolbox. But they don't need to know all those tools. Mm-hmm. They're not going to use most of those, but what will they use and how can that help enhance their experience? How do they feel and what they can do? That became way more important to me than what they understand. Okay. Intellectual. What can they do? What can their reflexes actually pull off in a random situation? And then if they stick with it long enough, they'll have a deeper understanding, and that will also refine and hone exactly how they put the movement together. But just get them in on a base level to be able to function with the reflex response interactivity within the system. And that was huge. That was a big shift.
Okay, cool. So then when you got to Los Angeles, what happened then? Did you find a different school to train at? Did you travel back and forth? How did that work out?
Right. So I'll back up a step.
Okay.
Back at 15, Danny and Osanto came on seminar tour with Sifu.
Nice.
And that outside of Wing Chun, I hadn't, some boxing was sort of a parallel life, but I hadn't had a whole lot of experience outside of Wing Chun once we started immersing in it. And then Danny came for the tour, and I got to spend some time with him. And that was awesome. Yeah. And his emphasis was in the weaponry at that time. So he was kind enough to show us, kind of introduced me to Kali and some escrima and got me going on that, and starting to understand how, the empty hand and the stick and are basically one and the same. And there was a lot of parallel with Wing Chun and its principles and how we express weapons as an extension of the hand and so on. Mm-hmm. And I also was assigned to teach him Chisao.
Okay.
So that was a wild experience, teaching Danny and Osanto Chisao at 15 years old. Per Sifu's orders, and him standing there and nitpicking everything I'm doing and how I'm doing. But that was sort of my establishing somewhat of a comfort zone with high-level martial artists outside of the system. So when I moved to LA, I had a sort of an old-time semi-retired stuntman who really in his heyday back in the 60s and the 70s into the 80s. And one of the first people he introduced me to when I moved to LA was Gene LaBelle.
Nice.
And so I woke up to the legend and the awesomeness that was Gene. He's, unfortunately, as you probably know, he's passed away. But yes. So I learned some grappling and got into some of those concepts with Gene and his top student, Gokor Chavichin, cross-trained with those guys and some other grapplers and so on. Got into the mix with that. Also studied some peripherally, some other Jeet Kune Do and that kind of thing, and some kickboxing and so on, largely to, and then later other styles of grappling, to understand more and more and more the nature of Muay Thai, what can come at you, what's the system, how do their systems think, what are their methodologies, and then how does Wing Chun counteract that? How do we deal with that? How do the principles and strategies and techniques counter and neutralize X, Y, and Z? And that to me was also very helpful. And the more I did that, I felt like that also was a huge tool as an instructor to be able to bring back to the students, so I could represent the pressure of the kickboxer, the pressure of a grappler, the pressure of a Muay Thai fighter or boxer, etc., and get used to dealing with different systems and not just always having Wing Chun versus Wing Chun.
Okay. Now you were in Los Angeles and going to school. What came first for you? Was it getting into Hollywood as far as like acting and doing stunt work, or was it starting to teach celebrities? Which kind of happened first, and how did that happen?
Well, I got out of school and I started auditioning. I got an agent and I started getting some jobs, and I hated it. Absolutely hated it. I hated the auditioning process. And when I got these jobs, one after another, they were horrific experiences, each in their own different way. But, having to like basically sue production companies to get paid when I was getting paid for the job in the first place. And it was just one thing after another. And this one last experience I had, I'm like, this is not what I signed on for. This is just toxic. And oh my God, I had the stress, and this isn't a healthy way to live. I enjoy creating characters and going through the exploration of that process, but this is a whole different beast. And I kind of decided I was going to go back to double down on martial arts and stick to where it was safe. Okay. So I kind of left the business, had another project that almost happened, a performance group back in the day. It was called Stomp. I don't know if you had.
Yes, definitely.
I had auditioned for Stomp because I had a theater background. I'm a musician. I'm a martial artist. So Stomp is kind of a fusion of all these elements. Yeah. Found objects using his percussion instruments. So on a whim, I auditioned, and it was a long kind of grueling in a way day, but cold call, just show up and do it. But long story short, I got cast as an alternate, which means that at the time there were 3 touring groups. And if I fit 2 types within the different touring groups. So one of 6 people had to quit. And if any one of those 6 people quit, I was the first in line to go take their part.
Okay.
They were at the peak of their popularity and nobody wanted to leave. They were having too much fun and they were getting paid too well. So a couple years later, I'm still twiddling my thumbs, waiting to go to work. And I'm like, I can't wait around forever. So the opportunity came up to join forces with another instructor from our lineage who had relocated to LA at that time. So we had opened up a full-time school in Santa Monica, California back in 1998. And that was my first full-time school after having taught part-time since 87.
Okay.
Weeks later, Stump called and said, "We have your role."
Are you serious?
Yes.
Wow. Of course.
But, things happen for a reason.
Yeah.
That's where we were. I followed my instincts. And not too long after that, Christian Bale had contacted me and wanted me to train him for the first Batman. We didn't get very deep into it. His father, unfortunately, had passed away and he had to stop abruptly to return to the UK to deal with that. And that overlapped with Robert Downey Jr. finding my academy and wanting to use the training to help bring him back into sobriety.
Wow. So his first meeting with you then wasn't about a specific movie. It was just he wanted to train and he wanted to use the lifestyle to better himself.
Correct.
That's awesome.
He had made his mind up that he no longer wanted to continue down the path that he was on. He really wanted to make a change and he just needed to know what that looked like. And he decided that I was the instructor he wanted to work with. This was the lineage. I was the guy, and he locked on like a pit bull and he wouldn't relent. I didn't believe him at first that he had the discipline to do it. So I did turn him down. He finally convinced me. And 21 years later, he continues to prove me wrong.
That's awesome. And I'm assuming with his career, he doesn't get to train as often as he'd like to, but skill wise, how is he as a student?
He has passed his Black Sash.
Nice.
Formally, and he hasn't officially graded beyond that, but he has skills that are beyond that.
That's cool.
He takes it early and has been very dedicated for a very long time.
Yeah, there's a handful of celebrities I've heard that about, that when they got involved in martial arts, they just it became part of their life, and they just same thing I heard about John Cusack, that Don the Dragon Wilson told that story. Someone like that who just,
I know he trains with Benny.
Oh, and yep, exactly.
Benny Urquidez. Yep.
So that's cool. I love to hear that, because it's, I've heard other ones where they're just like, oh, they do it for 2 months for a movie and then they never go back to it. And so it's cool that that he stuck with it. That's very impressive.
And I certainly have had that. I called them dabblers.
Yeah.
And that really, especially at that time, was not what rocked my boat. I was more interested in students that wanted to learn the system. And if they happen to be actors, okay, cool, but it doesn't matter to me. If they want to learn and they're serious about the long-term journey and the long-term process and really understand how the system works and the tools and reflex response systems that are part of it, that's what gets me out of it in the morning. And the transformation that is part and parcel with it.
That is awesome. Congrats. That's really cool. And that says a lot about you too, that someone wants to stick with that. I mean, trust me, I've had my, not a lot, but I've definitely had my bad instructors over the years. I mean, I tell everyone I had my John Kreese. My very first Taekwondo instructor was my John Kreese. Drove me to the point that I hated martial arts and was going to give it up completely until I met my current instructor. So it says a lot when you find the right instructor. It's life-changing. So congrats on that.
Well, thank you. Especially while I was going through it, I wasn't thinking, how cool is this? This is great. My face smashed in. I'm getting my eyebrows split open. I'm getting my lip busted open again. I'm nursing more bruised ribs, et cetera, et cetera. So Sifu was very heavy-handed. His personality, especially in those days, he was quite ferocious, and he would be hitting you and moving you around and knocking you down, and he'd be screaming at you because you let him do it.
Right.
It was an emotional, full, energetic bombardment. And I was constantly on the edge of wanting to quit.
Yeah.
And later I found out it had become quite a very famous quote from Ali. But one of the last things he said to me, which I never forgot, was, I hated every minute of my training, but I told myself, don't quit. suffer now and live the rest of your life as a champion.
Nice. I like that.
Literally, his words were what I held on to for about a decade.
Okay.
Because I was always constantly on the edge of, to hell with this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need this.
Yeah.
I had friends that were out, going out and having fun and doing this and doing that. And I'm going into the back of the house and getting my butt kicked again. Looking back, I could not be more thankful, because a lot of those guys that I grew up with, most of my early friends, addicted to drugs, jail, or dead.
Wow.
We were known as the desert rats, those of us kids that grew up on the edge of the desert.
Okay.
So the life expectancy in terms of results in life, we weren't we weren't expected to go out into the world and do great things.
Right.
At a middle school, what we call middle school now, a middle school teacher telling me it doesn't matter how well you do in class, how hard I work in class, I'm never going to amount to anything.
Jeez. Wow. Well, you definitely proved a lot of people wrong, so that's good.
It was an extremely valuable lesson. I remember, years later, we were had completed Iron Man, and we were then doing Sherlock, and we were on our way flying to the UK on the jet, and we're getting ready to tear down the beds or whatever to go to sleep. And I wasn't quite ready to do that yet. So I'm staring out the window and I'm sipping my tea, and Robert's over there kind of, getting things ready to go to sleep. And I remember just staring out the window, watching the world go by. And that teacher popped into my brain, and I hadn't thought about it in a long time. And it was just, what a great just reminder that don't ever let anyone else define who you are, ever.
It's phenomenal advice.
Martial arts definitely helped teach me that.
Nice. Well, one thing I definitely wanted to ask you about, and I'm ordering my copy as soon as we're done, is your book. Talk about kind of what led to that, and then talk a little bit. And my one question I have is, someone who's maybe never done Wing Chun or not involved in that style of martial arts, what about it would still be beneficial to them?
Great question. So my intention, a couple layers to it. Number one is an introduction and overview of the fighting system, principles, the strategies, the concepts, and then giving as many visual examples of those in application as we can. So introduce the principles, introduce the concepts, introduce certain strategies, and then you can see, here's an example of this principle in use, here's an example of this strategy in use, etc. Originally, I wanted to create for my own students and or any student that wants to immerse themselves in this particular system. And yes, there are differences between the lineages, which I don't necessarily need to get into, but at least within this particular lineage and how this particular system works, try to create, again, the big picture of how the system thinks. Because for me, I needed to understand that big picture. So then when we go and look at certain techniques and specific examples, those make sense because you have a point of reference, you have a framework, you have a lens that you now understand how to look at the situation. So if the car is trying to run me down and I don't understand the concept of moving out of the road, I might get caught up in thinking all the creative ways I can defend and counter the car while I'm moving backwards or clashing with it coming forward while I'm in the road clashing with the car. But if I learn, hang on, as a fundamental strategy, if the car is trying to run me down, I just got to get out of the road, get out of the path so I don't have to clash with it directly. So introducing some of these fundamental concepts, you understand how the system thinks, and with the hopes of folks that are, number one, already immersed in this system, can help understand that big picture, and I hope better understand the day by day, this technique, this drill, and ultimately help retention.
Okay.
Right. So we don't have, students that get frustrated and they don't understand, why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? And they get frustrated and they quit. So trying to help reduce that attrition and having students that start and stay because they have a better understanding of the game that they're playing. And from my experience, if you understand the game you're playing, the rules of the game, the tools of the game, it's a lot more fun to play.
Yeah.
Rather than just kind of showing you, here's this move, and here's that move, and here's this technique, and here's that technique, but not having a cohesive system that brings it together in a way that you can respond without thinking as a reflex response in that moment. So fundamentally trying to help and give back some experience and my understanding of the system in hopes that it can help current generations of students that are going through that process. Then number two, part of what made me really want to double down as a path of helping people through teaching with the art, as opposed to kind of hit a fork in the road back when I was around 18 years old, where if I really wanted to do it, I could have probably become a professional boxer. In Vegas, we had the sponsorship that could have been lined up and was sort of ready to go. And Sifu wanted to oversee how much Wing Chun we could legally get into within the box rules, especially at that time. And there was a little bit of pressure for me to be the guy to do it. And there was some excitement about that at the time, but something still wasn't settling right. And I also shared this in the book that at one point I sat down with the students, and instead of giving my sort of wrap up this is the week's theme and let's tie it all together and help you process what we just experienced and tie it up into a bow. This thing with the boxing was on my brain, and I had to sort of decide once and for all, was I in, was I out? And I just didn't have it in me at the time to go through that lecture. So I sat back, I shut up, and I just let them talk. And what came out was them sharing stories with how the training had affected them in their lives in pretty much every way except for practical application. There's one guy who was worked for a big tech company, and he was talking about how the training was so intense when he went up and had to do his boardroom presentations, he wasn't nervous anymore because no one was trying to hit him. It was easy by comparison. I'm just talking in front of people, I don't have, hands and fists and elbows and knees flailing at me, and the pressure of that. And then the one student talked about the benefits of the breathing exercises that we do and the sparring in a way too, because it's such a meditation. You learn how to watch certain key points on the body, and you just lock into those and you just ride that meditation, watch those key points and let the reflexes fly based on those principles and those strategies. And he said that meditative state had a huge stress reduction effect on his life, and it affected all these other aspects of his life. And I had another student, the Chisao, the contact sensitivity training that we do in Wing Chun to develop the contact reflexes. So you can feel and respond faster than you can see and respond, especially at close range. And the Chisao training enhances that touch reflex response. And he had said that the sensitivity that he had garnered through the Chisao training made him more aware of how his energy interacts with other people's energies. And he took that concept and applied it on an energetic level to his relationship with his fiance, who they weren't so sure if they were going to get married because things weren't going quite right at the time. And he had made these adjustments and started interacting with her energy in a different way to where it completely shifted the relationship. He proposed, and he now had this love of his life. And so I'm listening to all this stuff, and I'm thinking, what is wrong with these people? Nobody's talking about their awesome reflexes that they have, how strong they are, how fast they are, what good fighters they are. And I caught myself in my 18-year-old brain. And I said, shut up, sit back and listen. This is important. And they're never going to be professional fighters. They may never get into a physical confrontation as long as they live. So what's the point of doing this hard work if they are not seeing some day-to-day expression benefit from it? And they were experiencing these things in all these other ways that I hadn't even thought about. So that was a game changer for me, and it really clicked in my brain. I want to use this process to help people in their day-to-day lives. Nice. And this particular version of the book, I felt like rather than just give a straight up, step-by-step tutorial on the how-tos of the system, I also wanted to look into those other aspects, the slightly more philosophical and life applications. Let's explore how these principles and strategies can apply into your daily life. They can apply into business on a variety of different ways that don't necessarily have anything to do with physical confrontation, but they do have very much to do with how we deal with adversity in life.
Okay. Wow. Awesome. I'm excited to read it. I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna order it as soon as we're done, and I will put a link out there when the episode comes out for everyone else to go check it out. And a few of my listeners who have actually already read it and spoke very highly of it. That's one of the reasons I reached out to you. So a suggestion from a listener. So that's cool.
I appreciate that. That makes me happy. I do this in the hopes that it would be of help. And that's nice to hear that it's having some impact.
My biggest thing is finding, like I told you before we started recording, how busy I am. I've told this to many guests, but I used to read a book a week until I started the podcast. And now I'm lucky if I read one or two a year. It's just, so much of my free time goes into this, which I'm not complaining. I love doing it, but I miss reading as much as I used to. I have a stack of books that I've ordered from guests that have been on the show. I probably have 15 books now that I need to read. And one of these times I'm just going to take like a week off and just read for a week straight and get caught up.
Our paperback version, deluxe paperback version is now available, so feel free to add that to your stack.
I will be doing that. That's because I'm not I used to do ebooks a lot because I had the original Nook and it got damaged and misplaced, and I prefer I prefer holding it in my hand and reading it.
I wanted to ultimately try to make both versions available and accommodate the modern Wing Chun is part of the title. So trying to accommodate the way some things are done in modern times, but I'm ultimately old school and definitely want to hold it in my hand and be able to physically pages.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to it. So what are your thoughts on something like MMA, UFC type stuff? Is that something you're a fan of, or?
I look at, there's MMA and then there's, competition organizations like the UFC.
Yeah, exactly.
So MMA as a concept or competition UFC specifically?
MMA itself, professional MMA. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, there's sort of two different lenses right out of the gate, where there's anything that's a competition and that has rules versus systems that are for straight up street defense that have no rules.
Right.
Every part of your body is a weapon in Wing Chun. We have elbows, knees, fingers. You got to use your teeth if that's what you got to do to deal with the situation. Head to toe, feet, knees, everything. Your legs can block, your legs can kick, your arms can block, your hands can punch. Everything's a weapon. Your head can be a weapon. Your shoulders, your hips, your center, your balance, everything can be used both offensively and defensively.
Right. So
that challenge is right out of the gate and definitely keeps us on our toes. So just as a concept, right? Mm-hmm. So practical self-defense versus rules.
Yes.
So right there's a split. And so you look at anybody that's going to, for the most part, step into the ring as a UFC fighter, they better have an extremely high level of conditioning. So right out of the gate, they're going to be likely a superior athlete or they shouldn't be there. So respect for the level of operation that it takes just to get to that point, number one. But then there's the toughness of the individual, which again is another aspect to it. But the lens that I tend to ultimately look at it is through just the principles and their strategies on how they put things together, where they move and when and why. Positioning is huge. The angles, positioning off angle and not clashing directly up the middle. So I see a lot of very, very, very incredible athletes and really tough fighters. Mm-hmm. And if you're not absolutely on your game, they're going to rock your world.
Yes.
But relative to the lens that we look at such things through, I also see a lot of opportunity for improvement on a technical level and a strategic level. I'm taking nothing away from the high level of toughness and physical ability of any given fighter. And that aspect I find interesting. I co-taught MMA workshops in the past with a variety of folks, Pat Militech, Matt Hughes, Chuck Liddell, Kevin Randleman.
Nice.
Rest his soul, good man, Benny the Jet, Gene LaBelle. And so we co-taught Boss Rutan. We co-taught these MMA workshops together, and we all would take each other's classes and learn from each other and support each other and so on. And that was awesome, and learned a ton as well. And seeing also the differences between folks that were coming in and looked at fighting from a competitive point of view and were really, 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 really good at it. And a few of us that were coming in from looking at it from just a survival street encounter type of mentality.
Right.
And it was great ultimately to have the mix. And yes, we did sort of cross train and spar and so on, and kind of share information.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also a great experience and had just anchored my respect for anybody involved in that world. So I think it's both taken martial arts and put it more in the forefront rather than the background like it was. And it is definitely pushing the level of competition higher and higher and higher as time goes on. The one thing that perhaps I would like to see more of is the warrior code within that competitive environment. And I've never quite been a fan of the chest thumping and the showboating and that side of the theatrics that, ultimately as a competitor, we've agreed to do this. You're a pro, I'm a pro. We're here to do it, our jobs, and let's get on with it. And I respect you for being at that level to be even here at all. So I think there's room for intense competition without some of the negativity that tends to correlate with it. Side of it, I can test myself as a warrior without having to insult your family.
Yeah, like I said, it's that like the WWE. It's the trash talking that's kind of what turned me off from watching it. I used to be a huge fan, and when it really started going down that road in depth, it just kind of lost the appeal to me.
Because ultimately, regardless of the details of what I teach, I do my best to lead with a mentality of focus, discipline, and respect.
And that's how it should be, kind of what martial arts is about. So that's good. Glad you're doing that. Over all your years, is there just one philosophy at the top of your list?
I suppose the one that has had the most repetitive impact on my life is the concept in Wing Chun we call don't fight force with force.
Okay.
So in physical conflict and in daily life conflict, when I was younger, I was fast, I was strong. I was starting as a teenager, was a little bit of an angry young man, and so brought a lot of fire energy to the mix. And with the folks that I was dealing with, that couldn't last very long. Said burnout, and then as soon as I started fatiguing, they would just chew me up and spit me out. So I had to learn how to relax. In fact, that's one of my favorite quotes from Sifu was him screaming at me to relax while he was hitting me.
Nice.
Relax while I'm hitting you. And
that's good.
And he's right. So it's like there's a reason, unfortunately, why people that have been drinking very often walk away from car accidents where the unfortunate other driver does not. Because the drunk driver is relaxed and loose and can flow and roll with the impact versus most of us, and we tighten up and brace for impact, and that tension creates more resistance to that impact, and we take that on in the body more, and it's prone to more injury.
Yeah.
By not fighting force with force, by flowing through obstacles and keep moving towards your objective rather than trying to just smash through them like a battering ram. And especially when I was younger, I was always dealing with adults as a teenager, and I was not as a fully grown adult. I'm 5'10". But when I was still growing up through the system, Blaine was much taller than me, 6'2", 6'3", and 10 years my biological senior. And so I was always fighting adults, and most of them were stronger than me and larger than me, and opposing them directly couldn't do it. So I had to learn you flow around and then pop them, move around and then pop them. And the more liquid I was, the more formidable I became. And when you push on me, all of a sudden you just roll it off and you can snap right back and return fire.
Nice.
And once I understood it viscerally through the training and I got a little bit more mature, I could start seeing how going out in college and having to deal with those types of group situations. And I started doing plays and directing shows and so on. And then the film combat and choreography. And I started dealing with some really difficult personalities, some really difficult energies and huge egos and all that goes with that. And I still had to figure out how to navigate and flow through that and keep coming. And that also helped me later on, especially after Robert sort of pulling me back into the Hollywood side of things, and got back on the film sets and dealing with these gigantic egos again and all of that energy and just seeing past all of it. Just keep flowing through, and we'll do what we're going to do without fighting force with force.
That's cool. I love that. I've never heard that one before, so I like it. All right. I got a few fun questions I use to wrap up the interview. I know we talked a little about MMA, but like picture MMA, picture boxing. If you were going to step into the cage or into the ring, what would your walk-up music be? What song's playing as you're walking into the cage?
Great question. Probably it's an early Queensryche song off their first full-length album, which is called The Warning. The song is called Deliverance.
Okay, cool. Also, I'm not familiar. And I know music. I'm not familiar with that one. I'll have to look it up when we're done.
Ooh, or you know what? Maybe Child of Fire.
Nice.
I think I'm going to roll with that.
All right, cool. I like it. Awesome. All right. Who are 3, 4, 5 names you would put on your personal Mount Rushmore of martial arts?
Musashi.
Nice.
Feng Sayuk.
Okay.
And I guess considering my lineage, it'd be hard not to say Yip Man and William Chung.
Nice. Okay, cool. All right. Over your 45-year martial arts career, what's your worst martial arts related injury?
Worst, blowing out my left knee.
The knee is never a fun one. I hate that. Okay.
Back's gone out, go down the list. But most of it has fortunately been, it's painful rather than injury, surface bruises and cuts. And sometimes, somebody gets a little bit excited on the receipt, on the giving end of an arm bar or something and get the little hyperextension to the elbow. But blowing my left knee out, the first week of filming of going on Robert full-time back in 2003 on the film Kiss Kiss Bang Bang.
Oh, wow. Dang.
I did the entire film on a blown knee while teaching time during the day and then doing night shoots every night, 5 days a week.
Wow. Man, that's impressive. Yeah, I can't imagine. Wow. All right. Now this one obviously can't pick your own favorite martial arts book.
Ultimately, I think there's a lot of technical manuals, but one that had the biggest impact on me at the time was Way of the Peaceful Warrior.
Oh, nice. Dan Mellman.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's a former guest.
A wonderful exploration in the blending of coming to grips with the physicality of martial arts and the nature of it being for physical conflict, and at the same time living basically a life of Zen within what is ultimately movement intended for violence.
Yeah.
So Wing Chun was developed at the Southern Shaolin Temple, which was a Zen Buddhist monastery. So as a kid, what seemed like a contradiction, how can you hold those two in the same building? So you have these Zen Buddhist monks who created this devastatingly effective empty hand martial arts system. There's also weapons involved, but this straight up practical system. And to me, that book brought it into the modern day. I could relate to the lead character, and it was such a wonderful way that he took you through the journey, took you inside of the experience. And that, for me, especially at that time, helped me begin to live with the two seemingly conflicting aspects of martial arts, being at peace with yourself and with everything around you while being devastatingly formidable if and when need be.
Very cool. Now this one you may or may not have an answer for. It's kind of 50-50, but do you have a favorite martial arts video game? Did you ever get into video games?
No.
Okay. No worries.
Back when I was a kid, I remember Street Fighter was around.
Yep.
But we were doing it every day. I remember telling my friends, "Hey, you don't want to play?" I said, "Man, I'm going home to do this in half an hour." And we're doing it for real. So, and we trained so much during that time period where it kind of just didn't occur to me. And we didn't need the video game to do it.
All right, cool. That's okay. Good answer. All right. How about a favorite martial arts TV show?
I guess I kind of have a tie.
Okay.
And one is perhaps more dated now than the other, but my dad exposed me to the old Kung Fu series with Carradine back in the day, which I absolutely loved. And it wasn't until later that I found out that series was developed by and for Bruce Lee.
Yeah.
And he was famously shut out of it. And in a way, thank God he did, because that squeezed him to go do what he did.
True. But
Kung Fu series was one, and then ultimately the Green Hornet with Bruce and Vance Williams. Okay. They only made the one season, but my dad got every episode on tape, and we watched them over and over and over and over again. Loved them.
Nice. Have you checked out the new series Warrior yet?
I have not.
Oh, I mean, if you were a fan of Kung Fu, because that's the one that Shannon Lee worked on, and it was made from Bruce Lee's original notes for Kung Fu.
Supposed to be the original title.
Yep.
The original series was The Warrior.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal show.
I thank you for the reminder. I watch so little television that I'm not that hip.
It's on Netflix. If you have Netflix, it's on there, all 3 seasons. So
duly noted.
All right. How about a favorite martial arts movie?
Enter the Dragon.
Nice. That was fast.
100%. For the impact that it had on my life, getting me launched into martial arts, ended up training with one of Bruce Lee's primary teachers. I had John Saxon as a student at one point.
Wow.
Worked and trained with Danny Inosanto. I had the pleasure of meeting Bob Wall.
Wow.
And he surprised me by asking me if I knew the choreographed sequence that Bruce did with him in Enter the Dragon.
Wow.
And I said, yes. And he said, will you show me? And I was sure he was kidding. He was in the movie.
Yeah.
Bob Wall. And he said, I did it with him, but Bruce was so fast. Even watching the film, I don't get what he's doing. Wow. Can you please show me? I said, okay. He crossed the arms and he did this and he did that. And we went through it. And it was such a fun, wonderful out-of-body experience that here I am touching hands with Bob Wall, showing him his own choreography from the film that launched me as a martial artist.
That's cool.
Learning and working with Gene LaBelle, who taught grappling to Bruce Lee. And they first met back on the set of The Green Hornet. And the stunt coordinator of that series, who's now deceased, Bob Heron, was the stuntman that introduced me to Gene LaBelle.
Wow.
So had Brandon lived, we had mutual friends, and inevitably I would have crossed paths with him. So that film to me that anchored my martial experience. And then as I got into later in life, ended up meeting so many of the people that were directly involved, and had ended up meeting Fred Weintraub as well, the producer.
That's awesome. What a cool story.
So, Enter the Dragon.
Nice. See, that's my number 2, only because, as I told you before we started recording, Karate Kid. I mean, that was it for me. That's what got me into it. So that's mine, but Enter the Dragon is number 2. So, All right, final martial arts question. Now, this one doesn't have to be a martial arts movie, and it can't be one you've worked on. Any movie you've ever seen, favorite movie fight scene? And I got to tell you, I've had a handful of guests pick the fight scene from Sherlock Holmes.
That makes me happy.
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting story behind that one also. But for me, I don't like a lot of martial arts movies, but then there was a shift and things changed, and then they started making some really, really good ones. And there's a lot now. Okay. So probably the one that, other than Enter the Dragon, that really rocked me was the choreography from Jackie Chan's original Police Force.
Nice.
80, 81, somewhere in there. The stunt and fight sequences in that movie are just, I had never seen anything like that before. And that's when he had made that transition from doing the more kind of kung fu comedies and the period films. And he stepped over and started doing straight up more modern, the big stunts and all that.
Yeah.
That blend of those two and seeing him doing it was unbelievable. Just unbelievable.
Yeah.
If I have to pick one, I would say that was a big one for me.
Okay. So what's the interesting story behind the Sherlock Holmes fight scene? I'm curious. Okay.
Well, in past experiences trying to bring Wing Chun into film, didn't go so well. Trying to stick to the system in real situation, you're short, quick, as fast as you can do the movement. You don't want the opponent to register what you're going to do before you do it. Right. You don't want them to see it coming.
Yeah.
So, and then they get hit faster than they can register that they got hit. So in film, it's kind of the opposite. You need to show and then tell.
Yeah.
And so you give a little bit of a tell to the audience. So you cue the audience and also your fight partner, and then you do the action and they sell the reaction. So this part of the dialogue, the physical dialogue, is the audience. You see my character says, "Here I come," and then their character responds however they respond. So I was getting yelled at quite a bit to slow down because the movement wasn't registering on camera. So we agreed up front between Robert and I, and to a point, the director, Guy Ritchie, that we wanted to stick to the system as faithfully as we could and not change it for the sake of camera. And then we got into it. The cinematographer started digging his heels in a little bit and didn't like what he was seeing because he said it wasn't registering. It's too fast. It's too fast. So we kind of had a little powwow, and we came up with the notion that rather than change the movement, let's bring the audience in on it ahead of time. I said, Sherlock is pretty smart and he's severely analytical. So if he can look at the spot of, dust on your shirt and decide, what you've done for the last week, maybe he can take that intelligence and apply it to the opponent in front of him and do a quick scan of strengths and weaknesses and what he's going to do and how he's going to take this guy apart. So we go into his head, we see him work all this stuff out, we acclimate the audience to what he's going to do and why, and then we snap back to real time and he can unleash, and we can just go for the ride and not worry about leaving the audience behind. So I finally got him to sign off on the concept, and Robert took it from there and wrote the dialogue of the individual beats when we kind of sketched out, all right, let's take this key movement, let's highlight that, let's take this key moment, let's highlight that, put those chains together. And Robert went, yeah, got it. And he went away and came back and did just a fantastic job with it.
Wow. And it's one of my favorites. I love it. I love that scene. Usually when I watch the movie, I'll rewind it and watch that part like 5 or 6 times. Just as a martial artist, I love it. And when you were talking, like a half hour ago about that same type of thing, when you were learning from him and you had the way of looking at it, that's the first thing I thought of was that fight scene. That's why I'm glad I brought that up, because that you reminded me of that, the way you were talking about Wing Chun. So that makes perfect sense that you did it that way.
It finally all came together after, a pretty shaky start. And that was the first fight Robert had ever done on camera.
Wow.
Right out of the gate.
That's impressive.
He did a fantastic job. And the stuntman partner, Dave Garrick, the actor that played McMurdo, his former SAS turned stuntman, just tough as nails, fantastic performer, and took real shots for 2 days.
Wow.
The filming of that. So all that contact was real. We simply shot it on a high-speed camera and slowed it back down.
That's awesome. That is so cool. All right. Well, before I let you go, is there anything that I forgot to ask you or you want to be sure we get out there? And like I said, I'll put links for your book and your website and everything else, but any last minute stuff you want to get out there before we wrap it up?
I think that one way or another, regardless of the style, the system, or even beyond simply martial arts, that the art of apprenticeship on the path toward mastery of a craft, regardless of what path you choose, what that skill is, I think having to graduate as a human being through the path of apprenticeship under a master of something, of anything, is such an important part of developing ourselves as human beings. And martial arts, as my chosen craft, it's mental, it's physical, it's energetic. And so your mind, your body, your spirit, everything plays a part, and everything has to be lined up together at the same place at the same time, working toward the same common goal. And this, for me, and as I do my best to help my students through this, is it becomes a way of tuning yourself up. And I have a lot of students over the years that are musicians, and I'm a musician as well. And I would say, you would never play your guitar out of tune, right?
Right.
So, well, right now you're playing yourself out of tune. Your mind is out of tune, or your energy's out of tune, or something. But one way or another, a lot of us go through life out of tune, at least relatively speaking. So Wing Chun, mastery, immersion and mastery of just about anything of value, you learn to really get inside of that process. And I think that's really, really crucial in something that is a dying art, and the discipline and the hardship and the difficulty of being a warrior, doing the hard work, being consistent with it, and being okay with that. Day to day, doing the grind, the hard work. It's not always fun. It's not always sexy. It's really hard.
Yeah.
But it's worth it. Mentally, physically, energetically. And this is how a tool that we can use to tune ourselves up, tune in, and then we take up that tuned up version of ourselves out into life. And to me, yes, martial arts is my bias, but anything that can take you to that place and hold you accountable for and have that consistency and that discipline is really, really well needed in today's day and age, in my humble opinion.
I love it. Well, Eric, this has been amazing. Seriously, you are such an amazing interviewer or interviewee. Sorry, but I've enjoyed.
Talk about you.
Seriously, I've enjoyed this so much. This has been such a blast, and
it's been my pleasure.
And I think the fans are really going to love it. I can't wait to get the episode out.
Well, again, the pleasure is mine. Happy to speak with you, and look forward to good things ahead.
Thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist. We hope you will join us every week for a brand new episode with a different martial artist telling their story. If you enjoy the show, be sure to leave us a review. Also, be sure to check out our website at everydaymartialartist.com. There you can find all of our episodes and contact us to suggest guests and ask questions. Again, thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist, and we'll see you next week.